Just imagine, in Rome, a man so powerful and determined appears that he decides to rule forever without anyone having the right to challenge him. This man was Sulla, Rome's first lifelong dictator. He not only took control of the city, but used power, treachery, and cruelty to achieve everything he wanted. His history is marked by fear and drastic changes. Sulla transformed Rome from a republic to a place where a single person could decide the fate of everyone. Let's understand how he achieved all this and the impact he had on the history of Rome. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage now to be part of our community. Every interaction you make makes this space more special. Rome, a city that prided itself on its republican traditions, always believed that power should be shared, never concentrated in a single man. For centuries, the Romans believed that the strength of the Senate and the popular assemblies would guarantee political stability and prevent any individual from ruling as a king. But this belief was shattered when Lucius Cornelius Sulla made a decision that would change the fate of the Republic forever. For the first time in Roman history, a commander marched his legions against his own city, crossing the limits of what was permitted and establishing a dangerous precedent: military power over institutions. Sulla was no mere general. He was a man who had faced the adversities of Roman politics and knew that, in order to survive, he needed to be more than a strategist. He needed to be ruthless. His rise to prominence was no accident. From an early age, he learned that Roman politics was a cruel game where alliances were broken as quickly as they were made. He served under Gaius Marius, one of Rome's most influential generals, and stood out for his courage and cunning. But fate would place them on opposite sides. The rivalry between the two was not just a personal dispute, but a reflection of the conflict between two opposing visions for Rome. On one side, the populars, who advocated reforms in favor of the plebs. On the other, the optimates, who represented the interests of the senatorial elite. With an icy charisma and fierce determination, Sulla won not only victories on the battlefield, but also the unwavering loyalty of his soldiers. Unlike many senators who ruled from their luxurious villas, Sulla marched alongside his men, ate the same rations, slept on the hard ground of the camps, and shared the risks of war. This attitude guaranteed him an army that not only obeyed his orders, but was willing to follow him to the bitter end. And this loyalty was the key to his historic coup. When his authority was challenged in Rome and his position of command was stripped by the Senate, Sulla did the unthinkable. Instead of accepting the political decision, he turned against those who challenged him. The March on Rome in 88 BC was an event that left the city stunned. The citizens were accustomed to seeing legions marching off to distant lands, but they had never witnessed a Roman army marching against their own homeland. The streets were filled with panic. Senators desperately tried to negotiate, while others fled for their lives. When Sulla's legions broke through the walls, chaos ensued. Supporters of Gaius Marius tried to organize a resistance, but were quickly crushed. Those who dared to confront the general paid the price with their lives, while their political allies were persecuted and murdered. Never before had the Eternal City been taken by a Roman army led by one of his own sons. Sulla not only regained his command, but he also set an example that would resonate throughout history. When military force speaks, the law is silent. But this story is not just about a coup d'etat. What made Sulla take this decision? Was it pure ambition or a desire to restore order to Rome? To understand his motivations, we need to look at the scenario of the time. The Republic was mired in internal conflicts, with rival political factions fighting for every inch of power. The Senate, increasingly weakened, was unable to contain the violent disputes between the populars, led by Gaius Marius, who wanted to give more rights to the masses and reduce the influence of the aristocracy, and the optimates, Sulla's faction, who defended the power of the Senate and the maintenance of the traditional structure of Rome. In the midst of this conflict, Sulla saw an opportunity and did not hesitate to seize it. By marching through the gates of Rome with his troops, Sulla not only changed his own history, he also redefined the boundaries of what was possible in Roman politics. His act of defiance of the Senate's authority showed other generals that, if they had the support of their troops, they could impose their will by force. This precedent was followed by other greats, such as Pompey, and, later, Julius Caesar. The fate of the Republic began to take shape along a path of no return. The balance of power was no longer guaranteed by institutions and traditions alone, but by the steel of swords and the loyalty of the legions. Now imagine being an ordinary citizen of Rome at that time. Hearing voices, seeing soldiers marching through the streets, you knew that everything you knew was about to change. What would you have done if you had seen the standards of Sulla's legions flying over the temples of Rome? Would you have fled for safety? Would you have tried to resist, knowing that the city would never be the same again? Or would you accept the new reality, observing the uncertain direction of the Republic? Tell us in the comments what you think of this critical moment in Roman history, and how you think these decisions shaped the future of Rome. Your participation is essential to make this analysis even richer and more engaging. The story of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, before his rise to absolute power, is intertwined with one of the most intense and decisive military campaigns of ancient Rome. The war against Mithridates VI, king of Pontus. This clash not only determined the future of Rome in the East, but was also the turning point in Sulla's career. He was summoned by the Roman Senate to face one of the greatest threats Rome had ever faced, a war that would test its capabilities and, at the same time, open the doors to even greater ambitions. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, was a cunning and ruthless strategist. Not only did he unify the kingdoms of Pontus and Asia Minor, but he also strongly opposed Roman rule, expanding his borders to directly challenge the Republic. His ambition was limitless, and his ability to ally himself with various peoples of the East made him a considerable threat to Rome. Rome had lost control of several areas in the East, and Mithridates VI was determined to consolidate his power in the region. In 88 BC, when the Roman Senate appointed Sulla to lead the war against Mithridates, the king of Pontus had already launched a series of devastating attacks, destroying several Roman cities in Asia Minor. The threat posed by Mithridates was real, and, although the Roman Senate did not agree on how to deal with him, war became inevitable. Sulla, thanks to his military experience, was appointed commander, and his choice was not accidental. He was considered an experienced leader, although he was still in a vulnerable political position, far from becoming a leading figure in Rome. But his strategic skill and innovative approach to warfare stood out from the moment he arrived on the battlefield. When Sulla arrived in the East to confront Mithridates, the situation was not favorable to the Romans. Mithridates had already conquered much of Asia Minor and was advancing rapidly. His army was well-trained, composed of local soldiers and allies from various parts of the East. In addition, the king of Pontus had a considerable number of ships, which gave him superiority at sea, a crucial advantage in future battles. But what seemed like an impossible mission for Sulla was actually the opportunity he needed to demonstrate his skills. Sulla was not only a skilled military strategist, but also a master of political maneuvering. He knew that victory against Mithridates would mean not only the preservation of Roman interests in the East, but also an advancement in his political career. In 85 BC, Sulla faced Mithridates in one of the most crucial battles of the war, the Battle of Orchomenus. This battle marked a milestone in Sulla's rise to power, and his victory was not only a military coup, but also a political maneuver that would catapult him to the center of Roman power. Sulla's ability to adapt quickly to battlefield conditions, his innovative tactics, and his disciplined leadership secured a crushing victory over Mithridates, forcing the king to retreat. But most impressive was the way he used the victory to consolidate his position. After the victory, Sulla not only negotiated a favorable peace, but also forged an alliance that would further increase his influence, not only in the East, but also in Rome. His reputation as a victorious strategist began to spread throughout the city, and he came to be regarded as one of the greatest commanders of the age. However, while Sulla was away, Roman politics were in turmoil. His enemies, led by Gaius Marius, were gaining ground in Rome, creating an unstable political climate. As the Roman general reached the height of his glory in the East, the struggle for control of Rome began to intensify. With the war against Mithridates, the sixth concluded on terms favorable to Rome, Sulla returned to Italy triumphant. But what he did not know was that his victory on the battlefield would be overshadowed by an even more difficult battle, the struggle for supremacy in Rome. While Sulla was busy with his campaign in the East, Gaius Marius and his allies had seized control of Rome, creating an internal crisis that would test his loyalty and resolve. When Sulla returned to Rome, the situation was tense, and the political landscape was about to change. His victories in the East had strengthened his position, but they had also made him a target for his enemies. The Roman Senate, now divided, was in a vulnerable position, and the war that would begin in 83 BC would not only be a civil war, but also a struggle to define the future of Rome. Sulla knew that his position was at stake. He had the fame and military support, but the political challenges were formidable. The war against Mithridates VI could have been a great victory for Rome, but it also sowed the seeds of future instability. The question that arose was, would Sulla, the victorious general, be able to conquer Rome as he had conquered the East? Or would the interests of his rivals be stronger than his military victories? After his victories in the East, where he faced and defeated Mithridates VI, Sulla returned to Rome to a scenario of political chaos. The Roman general, now immensely victorious, little imagined that his greatest battle would not be against an external enemy, but against his own countrymen, and especially his political rivals. While he was busy fighting the war in the East, Rome was in turmoil. The Senate was divided, and internal tensions between rival factions, led by Gaius Marius and his followers, created an environment ripe for civil war. Sulla's return to Rome in 83 BC was not just the return of a victorious general, it was the return of a man with a clear purpose and an agenda that would forever change the course of Roman history. But what Sulla did not know was that when he returned to the city, he was about to enter a war that could not be won by traditional methods. The war he would face in Rome would be a battle for political supremacy, and the city would be the battlefield. When Sulla landed in Rome, he did not find the city he had left years before. The Senate was in a state of confusion and fragmentation. Power, once concentrated in the hands of the aristocratic class and military leaders, was being challenged by Gaius Marius and his allies. Marius, with his populist vision and his alliances with the tribunes of the plebs, managed to win the support of the masses and the humblest soldiers, most of whom were disillusioned with the Roman elite. The army was divided, and the soldiers' loyalty often lay not with the Senate, but with the charismatic leaders who led them. Sulla, on the other hand, had the unwavering loyalty of his army, who saw him as the leader who had led them to victory in the East. His army, highly disciplined and well-trained, represented a formidable force. But this strength would not be enough to secure victory without a decisive move. Rome now became a minefield of divided loyalties, unpredictable alliances, and a politics where any false move could mean death or the loss of power. Upon learning of the situation that awaited him in Rome, Sulla knew that the first step would be to march his army to the city. And so he did. By marching on Rome, an action never before undertaken by a general. This represented a direct violation of tradition and the authority of the Senate. It was a bold, unthinkable move, but absolutely necessary. By this action, Sulla was not only defying his enemies, but also challenging the very idea that Rome was a city of solid republican institutions. Sulla, upon arriving in Rome, did not find a city ready for battle. Instead, he faced a Roman army also made up of soldiers, loyal to Gaius Marius. The decisive battle would take place at Asculum, a city in central Italy, where Sulla's forces would clash with Marius's. Romans were about to face Romans, and what was at stake was not just military dominance, but the very definition of Rome's future. The Battle of Asculum was a bloody struggle marked by brutality and ruthlessness on both sides. While Sulla commanded his forces with skill and strategy, Marius's supporters put up fierce resistance. The civil war between these two factions was not just a contest between two generals, it was a contest for the soul of Rome. Whoever emerged victorious would not only rule the city, but would also shape the political direction of Rome for generations to come. When the dust settled, Sulla's victory was clear. He had defeated his rivals and cemented his position. But this victory was only the beginning of a series of confrontations that would still be fought on the streets of Rome. After the battlefield extended to the dirtiest aspects of Roman politics. Proscriptions, blacklists of political enemies, began to be drawn up. Those who were seen as threats to Sulla's power were killed, without trial, with frightening coldness. Rome, which was already divided, was now a hunting ground, where friends became enemies, and the most powerful clung to power by force. After the victory, Sulla established a regime of terror, the so-called proscriptions, which became one of the darkest marks of his government. The proscriptions were a list of politicians, senators, and Roman citizens considered enemies of Sulla's regime. These men were sentenced to death without the right to trial, their property confiscated, and their families persecuted. The streets of Rome were covered in blood, and the city, which had previously represented the symbol of justice and freedom, became a field of public executions. This period of terror did not last just a few months, but extended over years, as Sulla consolidated his absolute authority. He used fear to control the city and secure his position as dictator for life. But paradoxically, in eliminating his enemies, he also began to lay the groundwork for his own downfall. The hatred he had generated during this period of terror would not be forgotten, and the same brutality he had used to conquer Rome would also become a burden to him later on. As the civil war drew to a close and Sulla established himself as the undisputed leader of Rome, many wondered what would happen to the Roman Republic. What would happen now that a general had won the battle for supremacy? Sulla's death, which would occur years later, would not mean the end of his influence. On the contrary, his reign of terror would leave deep scars on Roman politics, and the model of government he established served as a precedent for other generals to come, such as Julius Caesar, who would seize power in a similar manner, but with even more profound consequences. Sulla's story is a reminder of how the greatest empires begin to disintegrate from within. But what came next? How could one man's ambition be the trigger for even more profound changes in Rome? Leave your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned, because the surprises don't stop here. When Sulla died in 78 BCE, the Roman Empire had already been profoundly altered by his actions. The Rome he had shaped with the force of his ruthless fist was no longer the same. His reign of terror, centralization of power, and breakdown of republican norms left scars that would last for centuries. However, Sulla's death did not represent a peaceful end or redemption for the Roman Republic. On the contrary, it was only the end of a dark chapter, but the seeds of future conflicts had already been planted. Throughout his life, Sulla consolidated a model of government in which the general had more power than the Senate, and the Roman Republic seemed increasingly distant from its original ideals. His death, surrounded by controversy and resentment, did not bring peace, but cast a shadow over the events that would follow. But what motivated Sulla to be so ruthless? Why, even after victory, was he unable to fully restore the Republic? And most importantly, what was his legacy to Rome? And how did his actions shape the future of the empire? After his victory in the Civil War, Sulla established himself as Rome's dictator for life. But he was no ordinary dictator. His rise to power was not only due to military force, but also to his ability to manipulate and dominate the political scene. By eliminating all his rivals and consolidating authority in his own hands, he transformed the Senate and the Republican institutions into merely symbolic figures. The question that many ask is, why did Sulla, a man with so much power, not restore the Republican institutions as a defender of liberty? Instead, he did something that seemed more like a fusion between an emperor and a tyrant, with a direct approach and without fear of any resistance. His famous quote, "Civil war is like a storm that sweeps everything in its path," perfectly reflects his vision of governance. Sulla believed that the only way to restore order was through absolute control. And it was this control that he imposed on Rome, a control that would generate the first signs of a disguised monarchy. One of his first actions was to reduce the power of the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes, who were considered defenders of the popular interests, had become a threat to him during his fight against Marius. During his government, he drastically reduced the people's capacity for action and restricted eligibility for public office, thus limiting the entry of new popular leaders into government. In doing so, Sulla demonstrated that there was no longer room for the kind of open and representative politics that characterized the classical republics. For him, power should not be shared. He relied on a restricted circle of allies, and in this way, his leadership reinforced a model of oligarchic government, where a few made all the decisions, while the majority of the population remained on the sidelines. Sulla's proscriptions were not simply an act of revenge. They represented a new era in Rome, one where politics were no longer based on values of debate and consensus, but on fear and destruction. The concept of proscribing someone meant branding a person as an enemy of the state, sentencing them to death without trial, and allowing anyone to kill them without repercussions. Sulla's list of proscriptions became one of the most horrific in Roman history. Hundreds of Roman citizens, including senators, generals, and even women and children, were executed without mercy. Their property was confiscated, and their families were ostracized. This cruelty not only cemented Sulla's power, but it also made Rome a city where no one felt safe. The friendship, loyalty, and trust that had once marked Roman politics had now been replaced by betrayal and constant fear. The immediate effect of the proscriptions was to solidify Sulla's power. By eliminating any threat to his rule, he became the undisputed ruler of Rome. But in the long run, this regime of terror had devastating consequences. The divisions created during this period would continue to fuel conflict and unbridled ambition in Rome for decades. Indeed, Sulla's proscriptions served as a model for other Roman leaders, such as Julius Caesar, who would in some ways emulate Sulla's use of power to crush his enemies. But as he consolidated his authority, the question remained, was military force the future of Rome? Fear of a dictator for life fueled revolts and insurgencies. Sulla may have managed to secure peace for a time, but his actions set in motion a chain of events that would make his own death inevitable. Sulla died in 78 BC, apparently of natural causes, but the true reason behind his death remains shrouded in mystery. Some believe that his premature death was the result of the psychological stress of ruling with an iron fist, while others suggest that he was simply exhausted from constant political battles. In any case, his death brought no relief to Rome. Although Sulla left behind a consolidated empire and a legacy of reforms that profoundly changed Roman politics, he was unable to prevent what seemed to be Rome's fate: the growing instability that would result in the fall of the Republic and the rise of the empire. Sulla's example, a man who used force and terror to rule, left an indelible mark on Roman politics, and his methods would be imitated by many others, including Julius Caesar. After his death, Rome entered an era of political turmoil. The Senate, though still formally in control, was now weakened. Rivalry among Roman military leaders grew, with figures such as Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar emerging to fill the power vacuum left by Sulla. These figures, fueled by Sulla's example, began to consolidate their own military power, and soon the Roman Empire would transform from a shaky republic to an imperial monarchy, with Caesar as its first emperor. But Sulla's death was undoubtedly a turning point. He not only helped shape Rome's future, but also indirectly helped create the conditions for the rise of an empire that would dominate the world for centuries. Sulla's death in 78 BCE was a turning point that went beyond the end of a dictator. It represented Rome's transition from a republic to something entirely new. Sulla, throughout his rule, had transformed Rome, and his death only accelerated that process of change. His regime, which combined violence with radical reforms, left a legacy of political instability, paving the way for figures such as Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. These leaders would emerge with a strength that Rome never imagined, perhaps not even Sulla, and would take control of an already fragile republican system. Sulla ruled with an iron fist, ushering in an era of reforms that, while on the one hand seeking to stabilize the city, on the other left a power vacuum and an irreversible change in Roman politics. He failed to restore the Republic as he had promised, but instead helped lay the groundwork for the dissolution of the political system he had known. Among Sulla's many mistakes, the most significant was his attempt to control the future of Rome through a centralized system that was overly dependent on his own figure. By weakening the Senate and empowering his military leadership, he paved the way for new leaders who also saw Roman politics as an arena for their own rise. His attempt to stabilize the Republic through reforms was, in fact, an invitation for the rise of military leaders who would later become the greatest threats to the very concept of the Republic. With Sulla's death, a power vacuum was inevitable. The Senate, weakened by Sulla's centralization of power, was unable to stop the rise of new ambitious generals. Pompey, with his immense popularity and military strength, quickly became a dominant figure, followed by Crassus and later Julius Caesar. These men were not just fighting for prestige, but for absolute power over Rome, something that Sulla, in his time, sought but could not have foreseen to the same extent. Pompey, with his military victories, formed the alliance known as the First Triumvirate with Crassus and Caesar, a strategic move to consolidate power without having to negotiate with the Senate. He believed that Rome needed a strong leader, someone capable of making quick decisions and governing effectively. His loyal and unbeatable army was key to ensuring that he became this central figure. But Pompey was not the only one who had his sights set on Rome. Julius Caesar, with his political skill and charisma, soon showed that his ambition went beyond that of any of his contemporaries. Sulla, who had created a model of centralized governance, could not have foreseen that the vacuum he created would pave the way for the rise of a new class of military leaders. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, no longer held the power it once had. As Pompey and Caesar rose to prominence, Rome's republican system was already irreversibly compromised. The Senate, desperately trying to maintain balance, was increasingly marginalized. The authoritarianism that Sulla had established now took hold of Rome for good. The model of governance that had previously been based on a balance of power was giving way to the control of a single man. Before long, Rome, the great republic, was departing from its history, giving way to a new regime. Rome's transformation didn't happen overnight, but Sulla's death was the first step. When Julius Caesar became the absolute leader, he not only followed in Sulla's footsteps, but also took the centralization of power to a level never before imagined. His rise to imperial supremacy was a natural consequence of Sulla's reforms, but also a reflection of how military forces and personal ambition were reshaping Rome's destiny. So, what did you think of Sulla's legacy? Impressive, right? If you enjoyed understanding how he shaped Rome, leave your mark here in the comments. Your view on the history of Rome makes all the difference. Let's continue this exchange of ideas.